I had just finished my tea when a car, so conspicuous it could belong to no one else, pulled up at the curb, arriving exactly when he said it would. Cyril stepped out before the driver opened the door for him, his eyes sweeping the street as he shrugged out of his coat. When he caught sight of me through the window, he raised a hand to wave, as though we were meeting for luncheon in London rather than in a town still marked by smoke and fear. He reached for my hand the moment he crossed the threshold, his other hand gesturing back towards the car, blonde curls still arranged in a way that suggested he admired the idea of danger far more than its reality. "That drive should be outlawed," he said as we shook. "If this story is not a slice of fried gold, Ashcombe, I will consider myself grievously wronged." My old schoolmate had earned the story in increments, one miserable, half-drunk evening at a time, back when Grace was only a name I said too often and never aloud in daylight. "It is," I said. "I assure you." I guided him towards the table, clearing a place for him to set his things, knowing I owed him far more context than I'd given, and that the truth of it should only be spoken face to face. But nothing runs until I say it does. There are still intelligence matters to clear. He set his satchel down, his eyes lifting to mine with a question he knew better than to ask aloud. "Later," I said, lifting a hand. "You will have the full account tonight over dinner once we are somewhere fit for it." Though he was ambitious enough to scent opportunity the moment it entered a room, he was not indecent. He understood restraint when a story required care rather than pressure. It was why I had chosen him, and why I trusted him here. This was my Grace after all, and I would not have her further traumatized for the sake of a clever headline. "Keep the questions respectful and gentle," I added, and framed in a way reflecting well on the crown, if you take my meaning. The satchel lay open, the camera coming together as he worked. A slight widening of the eyes served as his answer, exaggerated only enough to pass as a private joke between us. "That I do." Around us, the men who had delivered the supplies remained, cups of tea and Grace's confections in hand. They were not garrison men, nor inclined to curiosity for its own sake, because men who were well paid and employed at my discretion understood silence better than most. The response was immediate and entirely predictable, of course. As I said, one rarely encountered beauty of the Rowen sort without consequence. Sean let out a low, unthinking whistle before sense caught up to him, followed by Cyril's quiet exhalation of "Christ Almighty," offered less in appreciation than disbelief. I turned and found Grace standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting for me to come and approve of her. Time didn't stop. Nothing so theatrical, but it loosened its hold on me for a moment or two. The rest of the room became distant and unimportant, as though the present had briefly yielded to another life altogether. I had seen her less than an hour before. I knew her face as well as my own, but this was her as she had always been intended to be seen, appropriately dressed and prepared. A woman of her name and blood, restored to herself at last, stepped whole from memory into flesh. They say women dream of their wedding day. Men, less so, but I have dreamt of nothing else. Not in the indulgent or romantic sense people like to imagine, but in fragments and fixed points, details assembled and reassembled over years like a problem refusing to resolve. The cut of a gown, the light in Blackmere Chapel at the hour the vows would be spoken, the sound of her name once she took mine, even the trifles intruded. The colour of the flowers, the length of a veil, the order of service, the names of children not yet born, chosen and set aside, then chosen again. All of it began the day she vanished, and it never ceased. Not because I hoped, but because the mind requires structure when grief is given no conclusion. Planning became containment, precision became endurance. And so I built a future in absence, because it was the only way to survive not knowing whether she still lived at all. Every year since, I had carried her forward in my mind as she ought to have grown, refined where the world was kind, resilient where it was not. I had never granted myself the indulgence of imagining her diminished. And now she stood before me, the years folded back into place as though they had never been taken at all. The dress was a shade of blue I had always favoured on her. Her hair had been arranged with care, the dark waves and streak of white set to frame her face. There was a touch of red at her lips and something in the line of her throat and shoulders that made plain what her ballet training had shaped into permanence. She was no longer a child formed by instruction alone, but a woman prepared to be seen. That was what arrested me. Not her beauty, though it was beyond dispute, but the quiet confirmation that what had endured in my mind through absence and uncertainty had not been an invention. The world had, at last, aligned itself with what I had always known her to be. I went to her, and for a fleeting, undisciplined moment, the thought intruded that I might see her like this often, differently adorned, newly dressed, each day offering some slight variation, that it could become a private habit, this unveiling, that there were years yet in which I might learn every version of her I had been denied. The notion was checked almost as soon as it formed, put aside with the rest of what could not be afforded room. But once we were beyond the other's hearing, I laid my hand against my chest. "You look very lovely," I said. It was a woefully insufficient assessment, but accuracy was not always the same thing as restraint. She leaned away slightly, angling her body just enough to look past me, and the shift in her expression was immediate. Not panic precisely, but the look of someone who understood too late that something had already been put in motion and cannot now be undone. I wouldn't permit the hesitation to take root. Too much depended on this to permit her nerves any authority. "This will be straightforward," I said, putting my fingers to her chin until she faced me again. "A few photographs to begin with. Nothing arranged beyond what is natural. He will ask you to speak as you work. How long you have kept the shop, what it means to have Hearthwick return to order, and the like." I took her elbow and stepped back, steering her gently towards the tea room. "If you find yourself uncertain, look to me. I will be close by." She didn't come with me. Instead, she lifted a hand between us and used it to push mine away. "I understand what you want me to say, Captain Ashcombe." The meaning of it struck me instantly. This was neither nerves nor confusion. It was deliberate. Grace had always known how to manage me, long before she possessed the authority to refuse me outright. I had spent years attempting to shield her, instruct her, and prepare her for an unkind world. Somewhere in the process, she learned how to turn my own discipline back on me. Even as a child, she understood which words unsettled and which merely amused. When she was pleased with me, she ignored every correction and stripped my dignity down to nicknames so absurd I once pretended to loathe them, names I would give much to hear again. But irritation drew something colder from her. Then she made herself formal and distant, a reminder that whatever ancient authority I held over her was conditional and could be withdrawn. She never used my given name when she wished to wound me, not once. Title was her boundary, her rebuke, her quiet refusal. Not even the loss of memory had dulled that instinct. The rebels used me for their propaganda as well. Whatever she intended by the comparison scarcely mattered. That she believed I would make use of her suffering in that way was intolerable. I took her by the elbow with force and moved her past the stairs and into the storeroom before she could speak again. "That is not what this is," I said. "Not in any sense." The harm had already been done, whether she grasped it or not. What she had implied struck far deeper than pride. It reached back through centuries of obligation, through vows sworn long before either of us existed at all. Blackmere had been charged with her blood when England itself was still learning how to endure. Every decision my family had ever made, every life shaped, every sacrifice accepted, had been governed by that charge. To hear her place me alongside the men who had taken her childhood was more than I would endure. Yet it was not something I could correct with anger alone. I released her elbow enough to step back and restore the decorum required. "This is for you," I said. "I would never permit it otherwise." She only watched me then, suspicion sharpening her eyes, and I forced myself to meet them without reaching for her again. "Being a citizen of the Empire carries obligations," I said, and every countryman who prayed for your return through the years is owed your account." I paused, choosing truth over comfort. "So I am seeing that they receive you in your best light, my lady, and that—" What I didn't say, what could not be said with her this way, was that this vigilance predated sentiment entirely. It was older than this love for her. It had been carved into me like doctrine, like loyalty to the crown, like the tide's obedience to the shore. Protecting her was not an impulse I indulged, but a purpose I fulfilled, one I would carry out whether she trusted me with it or not. "British intelligence requires a photograph," I said, "for your family to verify before your re-entry to the country can be approved." She gasped, her eyes filling with tears, and I understood then what she thought of us, of me. She thought that we'd all let her go. "My family?" she asked, and shut her eyes. And she destroyed me with it. Not because she asked, but because she had to. Because what the rebels had truly taken from her was not only her years, but the certainty that she had ever been wanted at all, while every mile I'd ever travelled had been measured against the hope of finding her face at the end of it. "Grace," I said, and crossed the distance between us before the tears fell unchecked. "Everything those men told you about your family and your country was a lie. Every word of it." She opened her eyes, and I reached into my coat for my handkerchief. "Your people have spared no expense. Every rumour was followed, every lead pursued. From the day you vanished, there has not been a breakfast or supper when your name was not spoken, nor a Sunday you were not remembered at church." I let her sit with it a moment as I dabbed at her face, and I cannot even fathom how many Christmas gifts are waiting for you to open them still. I studied her face one last time, checking what the tears might have ruined, and only when I was satisfied did I fold the handkerchief away again. "So, let us have a proper photograph taken for your grandparents, and begin the business of returning you home, shall we?" She nodded and brushed at her face with her hand to dry it. I opened the door again, and waited until she was ready before leading her back into the tea room. I guided her to my side, adjusting her place on my arm, and nodded in Cyril's direction. I'd done this before, of course, countless times in fact. Escorted her into drawing rooms and parish halls. Walked her to church beneath the watchful eyes of people who already knew who she was meant to become to me. But to have her on my arm now, to return her to the world that had mourned her, to stand as proof that she'd endured when so many believed her lost, there was no title or honour I'd ever carried that compared to it. So only when Cyril raised the camera to capture the moment did I speak her back into existence. "Gentlemen," I said, "may I present Grace Annabel Rowen of Blackmere, the last of the taken children.